Hi Matrix, and welcome back to some more geography. Today we're looking at the trade and transport section of the human geography side of the syllabus, where traditionally in section B of your exam you're going to be answering either question 3 or 4, or both of them if you choose to do so. Remember just to follow the instructions carefully and to read how many questions you need to answer in the 3 hours that you're writing your theory paper. So if we kick off then, let's have a look at our first screen over here. To understand trade and transport effectively, just like our other sections that I spoke about last time, one of the first most important things you need to focus your attention on as you're studying is to study your definitions and your terminology very carefully. Remember, this is a section where the words or the jargon that we use in this part of human geography is very specific. And if you understand the terminology or the definitions that we're using, then you're going to get a lot of marks in this section. Also, in this section of the exam, remember to look at the reference material that they're going to show you. Diagrams, graphs, photographs, maps, all those sorts of things are going to be very important for your answering of the question correctly or accurately. Right, so let's go and do some recap. Key concepts in this section, you must know or be able to do the following, right? You must be able to define what do we mean by the word trade, what is balance of payments and how does balance of payments work, what is its economic significance, why do we study it in economic geography, or why is it part of this people and the needs section of geography as well. Related to that is something called the balance of trade, which you need to also know the definition to or how it works and what it shows. And then imports and exports. Remember, imports are what we buy into the country, and we pay other countries in our South African rands, which is foreign revenue for them. And we purchase all sorts of things like food and electronics and those sorts of things. Whereas exports, South Africa is very big on exporting gold, diamonds, various minerals, as well as agricultural products, food, cars, all sorts of things that we've manufactured in your secondary economic activities, and even tertiary services. We export a lot of know-how and human resources as well, with people working overseas and what have you. So imports and exports is important to understand, and the distinction between those two. Then secondly, you need to be able to identify and to describe the positive and the negative balances of trade. Sometimes when we're in a trade surplus, it's good for the country because we earn more money. Other times when we're in a trade deficit, some years we actually import more than we export, and then we'll have a negative balance of trade. But we'll talk about that at a later stage. Then we also have to be able to explain how the negative balance of trade, what I've just spoken about now, can be rectified or improved or fixed in a scenario where we are obviously paying out more money than we're earning, compared to the imports versus the exports. Okay, we need to also use and interpret statistics. You'll see in this little section as I show you a graph or two today, there's lots of numbers, and the graphing of information is important. In your explanations, you're going to have to decipher the information or the reference material that they give you, and based on that, a lot of the answers are already there. It's just basically looking for the information and giving it back to them to earn quite a few easy marks. A 1 times 2 question will get you the 2 marks that you need for very lower order or simple stuff that they want you just to think about and to give them the information that's available. Lastly, we need to apply your knowledge to the trading partners of South Africa, and also talk about our sort of relationships to countries like China and those multinational companies throughout the world which are not South African based. And obviously in that section we'll be looking at all sorts of things there about what's in the news, so you must stay up to date with what's current in economic geography by reading the papers, watching the TV and listening to the radio, because a lot of the times the examiners like to use contemporary issues or contemporary problems in the economy to base the questions in this section of the exam on. Okay, so if we move right ahead, let's start off with a basic recap or revision of some of the major factors that affect our trade and transport in South Africa. The first concept or the first idea is that of air transport. You know that South Africa has got 10 airports. I'm going to show them to you on the map in a moment. Airports Company South Africa, or what stands for AXA, is the company that controls our major airports. Now, we're not talking about the little airports or the landing strips and those sorts of things. We're talking about places where big aircraft are landing and hundreds of people are coming in and out of the doors of the airport in a day. You know that South Africa has got 3 international airports: Oliver Tambo or OR Tambo International, what used to be Jan Smuts or Joburg International. Remember to use the new names, but if you do have the old names in the questions, you know which one I'm talking about. Cape Town International has pretty much always been that, and it's still Cape Town International today. And then Durban International, which moved, remember, it's now quite a few kilometers up north from where it used to be in KZN, is now known as the King Shaka International Airport, and we'll point those out to you in a moment. The OR Tambo, you know, is obviously our largest airport, and we can carry or accommodate 18 million passengers a year that go in and out of our borders through OR Tambo Airport. Here's a map of South Africa, and I'm just going to point those 10 out to you and label them very quickly so that you know where they are, because it's important to know where the various airports are spatially speaking, so that you can use that information in your answers as well. The first one is Cape Town International, which is down here. You'll see there in the Western Cape. Cape Town International is one of our 3 main international airports for South Africa. Then number 2, we've got the ORT or OR Tambo, and that is over here in Johannesburg. Right, remember that is a major airport where we've now got the Gautrain link as well, and people use the Gautrain to get to that airport all the time. Then number 3, our third main international airport is King Shaka, or what used to be Durban International, and that is down here in Durban, but obviously remember it's moved a little bit north there to what it used to be. Then we've got number 4, which is the George Airport. If you've never been to George, it's a nice city to go and visit. That's down over here on the Garden Route of South Africa. And remember, this section of geography is quite tourist orientated, so you need to know a little bit about your tourism as well. George there, which is part of the Western Cape, and you can see it over there on the map, is our 4th major international airport, or major airport, not international, sorry. These 3 are our internationals. All the others I'm talking about now are important local airports, which we'll name. Then we've got Bloemfontein in the Free State. Bloem Airport is right here in the middle of the country, more or less, and that is quite a nice airport as well. They've done a lot of revamping and rejuvenation over there. Number 6 is Port Elizabeth Airport. Now, Port Elizabeth is down here in the Eastern Cape. There you can see it on the map. Remember, most of our airports had to be upgraded for the 2010 World Cup, and a lot of tourists were flying around the country to see the various games that they had to go and see in all the provinces. Number 7 is our East London Airport, and East London is also in the Eastern Cape. If you go a little bit further up on the coast here, you'll see number 7 on the map now is your East London Airport. And then number 8, very important airport in the middle of the country, Kimberley. Not a lot of people have been to Kimberley, I'm sure, but if you want to go and visit the Kimberley Hole, that's where you will fly to if you're not going by car or bus. Then number 9 is the Pilanesberg, also not one that too many people know about. That's when you go to Sun City over here, number 9, and you go and look at the Pilanesberg Nature Reserve, or you go and visit Sun City for gambling purposes, although most of you are too young to gamble, so you can't do that yet. And then number 10 is the Upington Airport. Upington, very hot place. When you go up here into the Northern Cape, there's our 10th airport in South Africa. So South Africa is in quite a good position, having 10 major airports where people can fly around domestically, and then we've got those international airports where our visitors, our foreigners arrive, and then they can take connecting flights to all sorts of provinces throughout the country as well. All right, if we move on now, let's look at ports, away from the air traveling towards the sea traveling or water. Remember, a port is a very important part of trade and transport, and many of us might not know what a port is. A port is defined as a town or a city that has a harbor. Now, a harbor is basically, geographically speaking, a place where ships can shelter from storms, or they can go and load and unload materials. You can have natural-made harbors or man-made harbors, human-made harbors, and that is where basically the ship can come right up to the coastline because there's deep water, and it can basically park or dock. We use the word docking alongside the coastline, and that usually happens in a port. Now, we've got various ports in South Africa which are very important for trade and transport reasons. And ships come and load and offload all sorts of things as we import and export products in our economic geography. If you have a look at your notes here, we don't really have navigable rivers in South Africa. We've got quite a few rivers, and you need to learn your rivers and your mountains and all those sorts of things, which is just good general knowledge anyway, but it's important for your exam to know basically the main rivers of South Africa, the Orange, the Vaal, the Tugela, and those sorts of rivers. We've got 3,000 kilometers of coastline, one of the longest coastlines in the world, because remember, we stretch, if you have a look at the map here very quickly, all the way from the east here around and south, all the way across to the west where there's Namibia here. We border 4 countries, and we've got 2 countries within ourselves that are landlocked in us, and obviously we have quite a big advantage of having all the sea frontage, or this access to the oceans, which other countries don't have in Central or Sub-Saharan Africa. It is important for our containers of cargo. We've also got dry docks in South Africa where we are unloading and offloading all sorts of things. Durban is the largest and busiest seaport in South Africa, and the largest natural port that we have is Saldanha. Now, I'm going to point out some of these ports to you as well on the map again, because it's important that you know where they are, and then you also need to learn what is the main product or the main good that comes in and out of the country at those different points. Now, if you look on your map here, just on this little tip here by the Western Cape that I'm shading in, quite a large sort of pink dot over there, that is the Saldanha Bay, and we've got Saldanha Port over there. Now, Saldanha is, I'm just putting the A on the end here before I misspell it, is the largest and the only natural port in South Africa. That's the first one. We've got quite a few ports, 7 ports to speak of. The second one is here in Cape Town. Cape Town Port traditionally, historically, was very famous as a halfway stop when people were traveling to the east in the spices route and trading in the Far East with India and the rest of Asia. And that historically has been the oldest port in South Africa, even when Jan van Riebeeck arrived there in the earliest part of our history. Then we've got the third port, which is Mossel Bay. Mossel Bay is quite famous for all sorts of things. We know that there's gas and all sorts of stuff that gets traded there as well. Then the fourth port to speak of is the Port Elizabeth. There's the word port in the name of Port Elizabeth. We've got East London further up on the east coast, which is also another major trading route and port of South Africa. And then Durban is a very important one. The 6th port of South Africa is Durban, and then further up we talk about Richards Bay, and Richards Bay has also got all sorts of things that we import and export over there. Mostly iron ore and your heavier materials goes out at the Richards Bay port. One that we're going to speak about later, which is coming on board and we're trying to develop it, is something called Coega, which I'll show to you in a minute, which is based down here in the Eastern Cape as well. All right, so our ports are the second most important way that we trade and transport materials, goods, as well as services to a certain extent. The third aspect that we need to just recap is the concept or the idea of pipelines. Now, a pipeline is something that transports liquid or gas, so oil, coal, gas, those sorts of things. We know that other things like sewage gets transported away from us and processed somewhere else in a pipeline as well. Petronet operates a network of 3,000 kilometers of pipes in South Africa. That's quite a lot of pipelines if you think about that distance. Large volumes of fuel are transported. We're talking here about coal, oil and gas are transported inland to the refineries and industrial areas. We remember we spoke about those the last time. The Gauteng, which is also known as PWV area, Pretoria Witwatersrandvereniging. Then the eThekwini or Durban, which we spoke about in last lesson as well. Pinetown, Durban Pinetown region, now called eThekwini Economic Hub or Zone. The Nelson Mandela Metropole, which also goes by the old name in some of the textbooks of Port Elizabeth and Uitenhage Economic Center or Economic Region. And then the fourth one is obviously the Southwestern Cape, which is Cape Town and those sorts of surrounding areas, which also is an economic hub or a zone of major economic activity. We've also been building a lot of new pipelines from and towards Mozambique. You'll see now in this map over here that I have, here are the different pipelines that I'm talking about. Okay, the new one that's come online recently is from Mozambique, this dotted red line that comes all the way into South Africa and ends in Secunda, where we refine a lot of that oil and obviously turn it into fuel. And then you can see here on the map there's a red line from Secunda down to Richards Bay and then also Durban. There's this green map from Durban to Richards Bay and goes all the way through Newcastle up to Sasolburg, where we make a lot of our petrol as well, through up into Joburg and then into Pretoria. And then also that other blue line also follows that sort of pattern. Notice there's a pipeline down here from Cape Town to Saldanha Bay, which transports a lot of the oil that we're buying from overseas countries that comes through the Western Cape. And then this Mossel Bay pipeline that goes into the sea, that's where we get gas from, natural gas that we're mining from under the ocean floor, which we pipe up to South Africa, and we use that for all sorts of purposes as well. All right, so that's pipelines. We've discussed air, port and pipelines. Let's move on to the road networks and talk about all the roads in South Africa. There's about 500,000 kilometers of roads in South Africa. Now that's a lot of tar. Some of it's not tarred, obviously it's sand roads, but the predominant amount of mileage in that figure there is well sort of resourced, decent roads to drive on, etc. They connect all our four major industrial areas, the ones I've just spoken about, and obviously we're talking about trucks and heavy sort of vehicles that transport materials like coal and iron ore and all those sorts of things. We've got the longest road network in Africa. All in all, 2,200 kilometers of roads are tolled so that we can pay for the maintenance and the upkeep of those. And remember, there's that whole sort of debatable issue of the e-tolling in Gauteng. Watch out, maybe that could be a nice sort of question in the exam. Make sure you know what e-tolling and that whole debate is about. Maybe it's in the exam, who knows. There's a fast link between ports because roads link the ports. Obviously, what comes from ships and then gets transported onto trucks, what we call a break of bulk point. Remember, your terminology is important in economic geography. Break of bulk, where we change from one means of transport onto another as we move our goods or our different finished products that we are exporting or importing, is called a break of point. A break of bulk, rather, which is things like ports, railway lines, those sorts of things. 80% of all the freight in South Africa is carried by road. Now, the big debate is we should be improving our railway lines, but I'm going to talk about railways in a minute. Have a look at the different road networks. Here they are on this map. Your N1, N2, N3, N4, it goes all the way up to, I think, the N14 is the sort of highest number that we have. All these blue lines show you where all the major routes, arterial routes, are running. And these are the roads that are usually tolled so that we can maintain and upkeep them by paying for all the work that has to be done to keep them in good condition. You can see it goes through all your major cities of South Africa, all the way down to those ports that we spoke about earlier, right? Which is all these that I'm circling over here, the seaports, and then those economic hub areas, your PWV, and the eThekwini Durban area, right? Or I had a number one there already. Number two, then we're talking about the Nelson Mandela, what used to be Port Elizabeth, Uitenhage area, and then the fourth one, the Southwestern Cape over there. So they're well linked and they're well sort of joined with road networks, keeping everything well sort of connected, as it were. Let's have a look at rail. Rail traditionally used to be the way that we transported most of our goods and finished products that we had mined or farmed, etc. So all your primary activities, agriculture, fishing, farming, mining, where we transport all those goods down to the ports and then send them to overseas markets, was traditionally more done by rail, and now lately in the last 10 to 15 years there's more pressure on the roads because people prefer to use trucks. It's just cheaper and quicker. It's not cheaper necessarily. Rails would be cheaper, I think, but it's just quicker and more convenient than using a railway line, which there's all sorts of other factors that you have to think about. Spoornet, the company which is responsible for transporting most of our stuff by rail, focuses on this as their core business. They have an annual turnover of 9 billion rand per year. So railway lines and transporting stuff by rail is still quite a good enterprise, and is still quite a good way of doing it. The railway lines developed with the discovery of gold and diamonds in 1886 and later on, 1884 even. And then the Sishen-Saldanha railway line is 861 kilometers long. And remember, we use that to transport all our iron ore that we've mined from Sishen down to Saldanha Bay. Now, if you look on the map, I'm talking about here, this whole link over here. If I just highlight it or draw next to and along it, that sort of railway line there that we're talking about is 861 kilometers long. Coal is predominantly transported as a product between Vryheid and Richards Bay line. If you look, here is Richards Bay over there, and just to show you on the map, I've got to put Vryheid on here because it's not quite on the map yet, but it's basically just here to this side of Newcastle. Vryheid is also a major town in KwaZulu-Natal province, and that little line there is where most of our coal gets to go down to Durban and then eventually Richards Bay, or if they take it this other way, right, it goes that way with the linkages that they might have over here. This map just shows you all the railway lines in South Africa that run through the various cities on their way down to the coastline. Remember, some of these names have changed, so you must just familiarize yourself with the new names. Polokwane, what used to be Pietersburg, etc. Right, so there are all our railway lines, and the transporting of various stuff by train across the country looks like that. Right, just to look at some of your notes there, trade is basically defined as the process whereby we import and export various things, and obviously we use trade to make money. We like to earn foreign revenue, and the ideal is to basically export more than what you import so that you make a lot of money. Trade is vital for any country in the world, and in order to trade, a country needs a developed infrastructure. Now, that's what I've just been talking about in the last couple of slides. Our airports, our ports, our railway lines, our road network, our pipelines, all of those are what we call infrastructure, where we can basically get to and from and transport material and goods, as well as things like services even, or finished products, from one place to another. South Africa has a very well-developed road, railway and port network. We've just discussed that. And this is because, or as a result of, the minerals that South Africa is very big in exporting. Gold, diamonds, and all your platinum group minerals, or PGMs as they are known. So read up on that in your textbook and be familiar with all those various minerals that I'm talking about over there. The value of imports, how much money we make from importing materials, compared to the value of exports, is what we call the balance of trade. Now, I'm going to show you a nice little flow diagram just now, where visually or someone who wrote this material has portrayed the balance of trade for us in a nice flow sort of diagram, which I'm going to show you in a moment. These figures are not always equal. Sometimes the one is more and the other is less, and that is when we talk about things like surpluses and deficits. If we export, have a look at your notes here, if we export, that means sending material or stuff out of the country, and we make money from exporting stuff. If we export more than what we import, then we have a trade surplus. We make more money, and it's a good thing. Economically, this is what makes us stronger, and this is what we need to be viable and self-sufficient. But if we import more than we export, then we have a trade deficit. We're buying more stuff from other countries and paying all our valuable rand to places like America and Germany and Italy and the UK and Australia and all those various countries that we do trade with. Remember to read up in your textbooks about who are our major trading partners, because that's quite important to know. And what do we trade with? Let's say, for example, Germany mostly. What do we trade with? China. We know clothing is a big thing, and it'll come up as a case study in today's lesson. So those are important to know as well for your background knowledge or general knowledge as well. Trade is often promoted by central government who will sign treaties. The national government is responsible for keeping trade going. And you know when you watch the news, President Zuma or some of our leaders are always overseas making negotiations or signing treaties and signing agreements with various countries so that our economies can continue to grow and that we both develop and mutually coexist, and there's advantages for both countries concerned. Other countries promote trade with one another, and that's the sort of name of the game. For example, in European countries that belong to the European Union, they do not have to pay import duties. So they get all these sorts of financial benefits or kickbacks, as it were. An import duty is a tax on important goods. If no tax, tariff raises the price of foreign goods and protects the local industry. So it's a good thing for us if we're not having to pay too much taxes when we import stuff. For example, in South Africa, if you look at the rest of this little paragraph here, cheap imported clothing is taxed to protect local textile industries. Remember, I spoke about the Chinese and our importing of clothes from them. These days, there is that tax placed on imports so that we protect the local companies and allow them to make more money and to be sustainable and self-sufficient as well. South Africa belongs to SADC, which stands for the South African Development Community. And this aims at reducing tariffs between members. So basically, there's a lot of trade agreements and benefits for all the countries in Southern Africa. And you must know which countries are part of SADC, right? Make sure you go and you recap that, because that's important to know. If you get a question about SADC, you need to know who the trading partners in that arrangement or agreement are. The world is broken up into numerous groupings of countries that have trade agreements, right? That's important among themselves. Such a group of countries is called a trading bloc. So you'll find a lot of the countries, here's some of examples here. OPEC, which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, they've got trade agreements about oil and gas and petroleum. Right, how we import or they export oil, who buys it and then turns it into petrol and then sells it, etc. Those relationships there are important. The African Union or AU, the European Union or EU, and then organizations like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Association, protects the United States of America on all sorts of goods and all sorts of fronts in trading circles, and obviously gives them benefits or kickbacks. Internationally speaking, trade is encouraged by the World Trade Organization. That's part of the United Nations organization, which controls all sorts of things, tariffs, taxes, rules, regulations, so that trade is something that countries cannot use negatively to put others at risk. It has to be a fair and a just and an equitable sort of process. So that's what the World Trade Organization is responsible for doing or for maintaining, so that we don't get people taking advantage one country of another, etc. It helps to negotiate new trade agreements and to implement these trade rules or these conventions that control what you're allowed to charge for petrol, what you're allowed to charge for all sorts of goods, basically to make sure that it's fair and free throughout the world. All right, so transport is a very important role in international trade. There's a very complex relationship between trade and transport, and hopefully you've seen some of those unfolding as I've been speaking about South Africa's context and how we use our various infrastructure to promote the trade of various goods and products. Remember, last lesson we spoke about all the economic activities, primary, secondary, tertiary and quaternary, and all the various aspects and what makes up each of those sectors of the economy. And you need to know those and apply that knowledge when you're talking about some sort of question that they ask you as a trade or a transport focus. Transport is a very important role player in international trade. Without container ships, railways, and international flights, trade between nations would be severely reduced. South Africa is trying to promote trade by developing Coega as a tax-free port. This will hopefully improve our balance of trade and also benefit countries in Southern Africa, or basically in the bottom part of the Southern Hemisphere, where we're trading with people like South America and Australia, New Zealand, and those countries in the Far East as well that are in the Southern Hemisphere still. Here's a map which shows you where Coega is. And remember, if you've never been to Coega or know where it is, a very nice tool is to use your Google Maps. Here you see I've typed in Coega, Port Elizabeth, Eastern Cape, and I've searched for it. And it's not on the map yet. Here's Port Elizabeth. But if we turn this satellite image into a map, we'll see later what it looks like. Let's just zoom in a bit and I'll show you where Coega is. While it buffers there, we can see this is a satellite image from space where you can see the sea and you can see the land. And if we zoom in just a little bit further, I'm basically going to this sort of area over here. You see there's that inlet into the ocean. That whole thing there now is the Coega port that we've built in the last while in South Africa. And if we zoom in even more, there you can see the ships come in and out of this bay or this area. This is a port now in South Africa. This is the one they are hoping to develop in South Africa as a tax-free haven. So obviously it benefits us and it benefits people that are trading with us. The imports and exports that come out of this point in South Africa, a break of bulk point, will be a good sort of way of benefiting importing and exporting of materials for us as well as our trading partners in the rest of the world. All right, so with regard to trade, there are many problems or stumbling blocks. And if we look at some of these stumbling blocks, we're talking about all sorts of problems where there's an attempt being made to eliminate the unfair trade agreements that happen between your poorer countries and your richer countries. So when we talk about the more economically developed countries, the MEDCs, and the less economically developed countries, or LEDCs, we're talking about the third world versus the first world, your developed or your underdeveloped nations, and how the relationships with trade and transport, or the use of trade as a result of who's got transport and who doesn't have transport, and good infrastructure and well-developed networks and systems, that can basically negatively affect poorer countries and positively influence or unfairly advantage richer nations of the world. The wealthy countries, if you look at the rest of this paragraph over here, basically control a large percentage of all trade. Because they've got resources, because they've got power, because they've got money, they can basically say how trade happens or doesn't happen. In South Africa, quotas are being used, right? We're trying to control how this happens so that we can restrict how much money is paid for imports rather than exports. So imports, remember, is what we bring into the country, and this costs us valuable South African rands. We don't want to spend too much money on imports. We rather want to make more money from our exports so that we make a positive balance of trade. Right, here's the summary that I was talking about earlier, this nice flow diagram. So if we start at the top there, trade, basically when a country sells goods to other countries and buys goods it needs from other countries. Remember, South Africa, we don't always do certain things in our economy. We don't have the minerals or the resources, or we don't have those sorts of things that we want, so we buy that from other countries to make all sorts of products or goods. On the other hand, we've got stuff the world doesn't have, like gold and diamonds and all those sorts of minerals, and so we sell those and make money. And that is where we come to this idea here of our balance of payments. If you look at the next arrow down from the top there, balance of payments is a statement or an account in which a country like South Africa transacts with other countries, and all these transactions are indicated there as what do we import, the goods that are brought into our country, versus what do we export, all the goods that are going out or sent out of our country. When you compare the imports versus the exports, you get what is called, or we can calculate, our balance of trade. This is the payment obligations that arise when a country imports or exports various goods. Let's have a look at an example here. In 1982, right, on the left, those are the things we exported, gold and all our other exported products. And if you look at these figures here, we're talking about statistics that are in millions of rands. So in 1982, we exported 8,641 million rand of gold. Remember, we have to put like another 6 zeros at the end here to make that number what it should be. But to keep it simple, they take all the zeros off and they write it in the little scale on the top here that this is millions of rands that we're talking about. So 8,641 million rand of gold in 1982. And then in 1983, a year later, look at how that figure shot up. There we exported 9,929 million rands worth of gold into the world or to various nations that we trade with. Our other exports, grain, all the various crops, all sorts of stuff that we also export, total 10,649 million in 1982 and 10,779 million in 1983. These are very old statistics going quite a few years back now, but you can get a sense that when you total those up, that's the amount of money we are making from our exports, 19,290 million and 20,708 million in 1983. Now compare that to the imports on the other side of this little balance sheet, as it were. There's the goods we imported, 20,079 million in 1982, and then it went down to 17,545 million a year later in 1983. So when you subtract these figures, right, 19,290 minus that, we get a negative number there. Can you see that? That's minus 789 million. So we were 789 million rand short compared to what we imported versus what we exported. And so in that year, we had what we call a trade deficit, right? We didn't make any money. We were in the negative, in the red. But if you have a look at the following year, let me just erase that so we can see these numbers here. There we had a plus amount or a positive amount, 3,163 million rand. That's the difference between that figure minus that figure, right? There we had what is known as a trade surplus. So things were good, things were looking up. A year later, we had improved our economy and things were on the sort of upturn, as it were. If we follow this flow diagram down further, here's the difference between what we call a positive balance of trade versus a negative balance of trade. Can you see in 1982, we had exports exceeding imports. The exports, right, this is 1983. Let's start again. Positive balance of trade, exports exceeded the imports. So in 1983, we made more money from our exports than what we paid out on the imports. So we had a, look at the scale here, a favorable balance of trade, a trade surplus. Whereas a year earlier, or a year prior to this, 1982, our imports exceeded our exports. We actually bought more stuff from the world than what we traded with the world, and we ended up with a trade deficit. More money was spent on our imports, and we made less money from our exports. So look at the scale now. Now the imports is heavier, and it's tipping the scale in the other direction, and thus we have an unfavorable balance of trade when that scenario happens, when we have what is called a trade deficit. How South Africa rectifies this balance of trade is related to certain things. We have to try and increase our exports, decrease our imports, make more money from foreign revenue, right? Earn pounds, earn yen, earn dollars, etc. Right? I forget all the symbols for the various currencies of the world here. And basically spend less money buying stuff from the world, and also try and export more gold, because that's where we make a lot of money. Gold is very valuable, and it's one of our chief or primary exports that make the most money compared to things like other stuff that we export, clothes, cars, food, etc., etc. So that obviously doesn't earn as much as gold does. All right, I think this is a good place for us to have a quick little ad break, so I'll see you after the break. Welcome back, Matrix. Now we're going to look at some past exam papers. And remember, when you're answering section B of your exam, which is question 3 or 4, a lot of the time they're giving you source material or reference material that contains a lot of the answers or a lot of the information that they are asking you for. So be wary of looking at stuff and really understanding the material or deciphering the graph or the map or the photo or whatever they've given to you, And then based on that, look carefully at task words in the question as well. Are they asking you to explain or to describe or to list or to justify? Make sure you understand what the question is wanting you to do before you answer the question as well. And remember, read carefully and make sure that you're on top of what needs to be done. So let's have a look at the first question then. These are all past paper questions that have been taken from various Department of Basic Education, or what used to be the Department of Education's old matric exams, finals, as well as maybe even supplementary papers. The first question starts off by asking you to define the concept balance of payments. Now remember, this is a 1 times 2 question, and when we are answering a 1 times 2 question, we are usually writing a sentence, or we're giving a statement that we've explained or elaborated or written out fully so that we can earn those double marks. Remember, a times 2 here means that we are getting marks for thinking in geography, and that's why they're doubling the points. So define the concept of balance of trades. Basically, we're talking about the comparison of the value between goods that are imported versus exported. Remember, we spoke about this concept in a little explanation earlier before the break. Whatever we import versus what we export is known as the balance of payments. And sometimes you can have a favorable balance, or sometimes you can have an unfavorable balance of trade. It's a good thing or a bad thing, and then that has economic repercussions for the country for that year or for that cycle. Okay, so 2 marks. You'll get the 2 marks here for having spoken about imports and exports, and then the key here, keyword is value, for that other mark to get 2 out of 2. Question 1.2 asks or says, describe ways in which agriculture, that's important, so highlight that, could possibly contribute to a favorable trade balance in South Africa. Now remember, agriculture is a primary economic activity, and our economy is not always based on the primary sector. Our economy has developed a little bit more. We're slightly more advanced than most countries in Africa, and we have secondary or tertiary activities that make up the predominance of the economic activities. So this question here is a 4 times 2, 8 mark question. It's a lot of marks. You have to say 4 things that you've explained or written out fully to be able to get those double marks. And remember, we are describing, saying how something is, the way in which agriculture could be a major contributing factor towards a favorable balance of trade. How can we use agriculture to have a good positive balance of trade year in and year out? Okay, so to answer question 1.2, we could say something like agriculture or agricultural production basically can earn foreign revenue, right? In today's day and time, remember, climate change is a big issue. So obviously, if we're growing food which countries can import or buy from us because they are having droughts or heat waves or bad climatic conditions associated with climate change and global warming, we can make more money from agriculture if we're selling that products to a foreign nation. So agriculture production means that we do not have to import as much food. We can also earn foreign revenue. Not having to import as much food means we also save money from our import costs, and that is a positive thing as well for us. So that's a first point there for 2 marks. We can also say agricultural products can earn revenue when they're exported, and that's there where I spoke about this concept of foreign revenue. We can make money by exporting our stuff, 2 marks over there. And then also, if we look at things like agricultural products or goods can be processed and then exported. Agricultural products or goods can be further processed, or processed actually, before we export them, means we make more money as well. Remember, so things like exporting it, 2 marks over there. instead of just selling the corn, rather keeping it and tinning it and then selling the tinned corn, we can get more money for that than just selling the raw material, as it were, and make more money like that as well. Finally, we could say goods that are exported, all sorts of crops and things that we are agriculturally growing, right? Goods that are exported are sold in dollars or in foreign revenue. So if we can sell something in foreign revenue that we've grown, which is cheap for us to do, and then we make nice profit by selling it to overseas countries, then we're obviously going to earn foreign exchange, which is stronger than the rand, and that's a good thing for our balance of trade. Remember, we're answering that question about balance of trade or trade balance in this question for 8 marks. You need to say 4 different things that you've explained fully and you've written out as a nice sentence, and you're earning the double marks per point, and then you're going to get 8 marks for question 1.2. Right, question 1.3 says, how can South Africa improve its trade balance without being too dependent on the gold price? So again, the concept here is trade balance that they're testing, but now they're asking you how, right? How can we improve our trade balance without depending too much on the gold price? Because remember, the gold price was the traditional way of how, or is still in many ways, the way that our economy is gauged or measured according to being successful or not so successful. So how can we get away from that? How can we be a positive trade balance without depending on that gold price is what they're asking you for. And remember, 3 ideas here for 6 marks is what we need to get those 6 points. First of all, we can say South Africa. Remember, I've written essay, but you need to write out South Africa in your exam. Don't use too many abbreviations, right? I'm just trying to save us time here and get through more questions. But when you're writing properly, you need to write out in full. South Africa needs to import, right? Less oil in particular. Oil costs us a lot of money. And if we can import less oil, that will mean we depend less on the gold price for our economy, and we can save money. 2 marks. Secondly, South Africa, right? Let me be a role model and write out what I've told you to do. South Africa needs to process and then export the products. Remember, that is called benefication. If we first process and we turn that product into something more valuable, we're going to make more money if we're exporting it rather than just the raw material involved, right? There's our first and our second. Here's our third point coming up. Benefication, what I've just spoken about there in that previous point, but now I'm taking it further and elaborating a little bit more. Benefication will not only earn higher prices, but right, not only are we going to earn more or higher prices for that material, but it will also create more jobs. It helps create more jobs, and job creation is very important in South Africa. Right, so any of those 2 ideas there will get us those other 2 marks. Remember, we're only looking for a 3 times 2, so we only need 3 points for the 6 marks. But explaining and justifying and elaborating on what you have said is the important thing here to earn that double up that we're talking about. Right, let's move on to question 2. Notice the first question was just simple, straightforward learning material. Stuff that you had to have studied, the definitions you need to have known. There was a little bit of application of your knowledge in question 2 and in question 3 of number 1, but basically it was the easy stuff and the stuff that you've had to rote learn which came up. That will always happen in the beginning part of any question. Have a look at question 2 here, for example. Provide the correct term for the following. Right, so this whole question is just terminology based. If you haven't learned your words and your definitions, you're not going to know what to write here. And remember, this is an easy 6 marks, or 6 out of 100 marks in that question, 6% of that whole part of the paper. All right, question 2.1, export value is greater than import value. What word or what term explains when our exports are higher or more than our imports? Right, or what is that concept that we're talking about? And that is a negative trade, or we can talk about the fact that we have a trade surplus. Right, it's not negative trade. I've confused it here, so let's delete that. The answer here, exports being more than your imports, what's that called? It's called a trade surplus, when we've got more stuff going out of the country than coming in, and we're earning more foreign revenue, so it's a good thing for our economy. 2 marks. Question 2.2 says, what do we call it when the value of all goods and services produced in a country in 1 year? In other words, what is the name for that term or for that definition? That is known as our gross domestic product. Remember, GDP or gross domestic product is the means or the measurement where we determine the value of goods or services produced in a single year, sometimes per person. We call that per capita, and obviously this is for a good measure of our economic wealth or our economic well-being. Question 2.3, what do we call, or what is the United Nations Policy on Sustainable Development known as? What single term or word can you use here for 2 marks that talks about the UN's policy on sustainability or sustainable development? Hopefully you've done your studying and you know that Agenda 21 is the name of that document that we're talking about. Agenda 21 documents all the processes and policies and ways that we're trying to get poorer countries to be sustainable and to develop sustainably. So that was developed by the United Nations. Right, question 3 is a little bit more complex now. Question 1 and 2 was a little bit easier and just setting up sort of your basic knowledge, testing some of the key concepts and ideas that you've studied. Now question 3, we're going to get into more application and heavier sort of thinking of stuff. You'll see there, the preamble says, study the graph on the page below, or study the graph below. Right, we just fix the grammar here, which shows the total population, the economically active population, and the employment trends in South Africa. So this graph is showing us 3 things. First of all, it's showing us how many people there are in South Africa over a year period. Right, remember, any graph has got 2 sets of axes. Here on the bottom, you've got time from 1960 all the way across to the year 2000. And on the horizontal axes, there's 2 of them. There's one on this side and there's one over here. They're both showing numbers of people in millions of people. So that's the first thing this graph shows. It shows us how many people are in South Africa over a time period. Secondly, it also shows us the economically active population. Now, if you look very carefully at your graph here, you've got a whole lot of different color-coded or shaded areas, right? The dotted area talks about the rest of the population. The white area in the middle over here that I'm highlighting with my pink line, that whole area from top to bottom shows us how many people are unemployed over the time frames. Then the black area, all this stuff over there from left to right, shows us the unskilled employment. People who are employed but they're not trained, they haven't been past matric, or they don't have a degree, etc. They're not necessarily fitters and turners or plumbers or electricians. They haven't gone and studied a trade and got a further qualification past school. The skilled employment, people that have studied further at whatever level, degree, diploma, whatever, that makes up this sort of light grey mode down here that I'm dotting on the graph. That's the bottom part of the graph, the skilled laborers, or the skilled employers, employed people. And then there's unemployment if sanctions had continued after 1990. This whole sort of part of the graph here. If we didn't come back into the world community and we still didn't do away with apartheid and all that sort of stuff, then that would have been the negative influences of sanctions, economic sanctions on South Africa, which would have translated into job losses and higher levels of unemployment as well. So that's an important little interesting part of the graph there. You'll see it only features from 1990 onwards, and it's an if scenario, right? If we hadn't changed, etc., etc. Always look at the source of your information. This comes from the National Manpower Commission, so that's an important thing to just remember there in the background. So the third thing there is the employment trends in South Africa over time. That's the third aspect, or the third part of this graph. So we've spent a little bit of time looking at the graph and deciphering it, right? You can see we go from in 1960, something like, look at the scale here, that's half between 10 and 20, so that's about 15 million over there. And we're up to 47.5 million people in the year 2000. That's how many South Africans there were when we did a census in 2000, 12 years ago now. And then they've also got some statistics here of the top end of these lines on the graph. That point over there is 17.8 million, 10 million, 8 million, and 6.0 million over there as well. Right, so let's look. What sorts of questions are they going to ask us about this graph? Number 1, 3.1. The graph shows that many people were unemployed in 1995. So let's go back and look. Here is 1995. If we look up onto the graph, horizontally speaking, vertical upward sort of trajectory, we can see there we talk about the unemployed people from there up to there, right? That is not the widest part of the graph between the one area and the other area, right? So they're talking about this sort of area of the graph shows us how many people were unemployed in the population in a particular year. In this case, we're talking about 1995, right? We remember we've spoken about all these keys and what the key means, so I can just take out some of this extra information which is blurring our deciphering and appreciation of this graph, right? So we can focus on what each specific question wants us to look at now in detail. So there's the statement. 1995, a lot of people were unemployed, right? So you can work out the difference between those figures in a minute there. Okay, question 3.1.1 says, calculate the number of people who will be unemployed in the year 2000. Now remember, this little statement previously said the graph shows that many people were unemployed in 1995. So this graph probably was published or made available from research that was done in 1995. And what they've done is they've projected 5 years ahead what they think the scenario is going to be like. Now, question 3.1.1.1 wants us to look at how many people there are between the top part of that white area in the graph and the bottom part of that area, because remember we're looking at this key or legend which shows us the unemployed level of people in this year. If you read up the scale, the year 2000 is on that part of the graph if we go upwards. So to calculate that, we're going to say 17.8 million minus 10.0 million. That's how we work it out. 17.8 million minus 10.8 million. A simple calculation, the answer is 7.8. 17.8 minus 10 is 7.8 million people. And that will get us our 2 marks. Those are the number of people who are going to be unemployed in the year 2000 as a projection. All right, then question 3.1.2 says, give the total population of South Africa for 1960. What was the number of South Africans in the year 1960? So we go back to the graph and we read up here. Remember, I pointed it out earlier here. When you look at your scale, here's 10, there's 20, so halfway is there, 15. If we look and we read up on the scale, there, the top of that line, which is the population, the total population over there, is going to be between 15 and 16 million people. Now, if you're not sure that it's exactly 15, then just say, yeah, between 15 to 16 million people is how many South Africans there were in 1960, and that'll be sufficient. They do give you leeway in the exam, and they will allow that for the full marks. Question 3.2. State briefly what is meant by economically active population. What do we mean by the economically active population in South Africa? So in other words, go back to the graph and you see this keyword over here, total economically active population, right? That means between here and the top of that graph, the people that are working in a particular year over all the years here are people that are contributing to the economy because they have a job, they are of working age, they can work, it's legal, etc., etc. So for 2 marks over there, we are talking about people in the society or people in the population who are capable of working. One point. right? But now to get the double marks, you must just give some sort of rationalization or some further justification of what you're saying. In other words, people between the ages of 16, they're older than 16, up to 64 years of age. Because remember, in South Africa, it's legal for everyone to go on to pension or to retire when you hit the age of 64. So there, for 2 marks, you need to say all of that there. People that are between the ages of 16 to 64 years of age are the economically active group of the population, those that are capable of working or who have a job or who can work, legally speaking, and from a health point of view as well, they are able to work also. Question 3.3, briefly explain. Remember, keyword is explain here. Question or task words are very important. If you don't understand what is being asked of you, the chances are you're going to answer incorrectly. So make sure you understand the question or the task word of what you need to do. Briefly explain why there was substantial unemployment in 1995. What happened in 1995 over here? Go back to the graph. Remember, the whole time you are consulting or referring to this graph because that's what the question is based on. Remember, if you look here in 1995, it's quite a wide gap there from the top part of the graph to this white area and then the grey area beneath that as well. And then they've also projected here how many people could be unemployed if South Africa was still busy with its apartheid policy and we hadn't done away with our racial segregation and terrible political stances and ideas. That would have been even worse. The employment rate would have been higher. They've projected that there in that little grey zone, this area that they talk about over here in the graph. So for 4 marks there, this is a 2 times 2 question. For 4 marks, what are we going to say or how are we going to answer this question that briefly explains why there was so much unemployment in the year 1995? Okay, first of all, if you have a look at the graph, in the year 1995, look at these other coded things here. Unskilled employment is the black zone, and then skilled employment is this grey zone, and then unemployed and that other grey color is how many people don't have jobs. So there was more people than ever in the past year, apart from maybe that year over there. More people in this sort of zone up and down that are unemployed in the year 1995. So the first thing we can say there for 2 marks is that there is a larger unskilled population than ever before. And obviously you can expand that whole idea by talking about the effects of apartheid and Bantu education and the fact that certain people didn't have the skills they should have had up until that point to be able to be employed and to have a job, etc., etc. So that will be your 2 marks over there. Another concept or thing you could be talking about here is that the former homelands, remember, which were only abolished a couple of years before 1995 here, of South Africa, your Bafuthatswana, Ciskei, Transkei, all those places that you learn about, all those former homelands are now included in South Africa, the democratic South Africa, after 1994's miracle and the democracy, our birth as a new nation, etc. Those numbers are included in these statistics, and that obviously pushes up the level of unemployment, or it shows that there are more unemployed people in South Africa, which was the case, which is true, because many people were obviously unfairly kept in the homelands, not allowed to come to urban areas, getting a job, etc., etc. You can also talk about the fact that many laws, such as the pass laws, for example, were obviously abolished or removed. And these removal or abolishment of the pass laws meant that higher numbers of people or larger numbers of people were obviously now coming into urban areas. And when they moved to urban areas, they didn't necessarily find a job, and thus high levels of unemployment were the common sort of denominator, or that's what accounted for the fact that all these people who didn't have jobs or couldn't get jobs are unemployed. as they moved to the cities or they came to the urban areas. So any 2 ideas here for 4 marks, 2 times 2 will get you those marks over there. All right, let's have a look at question 4. Now, remember I said that you will get a graph or a map or a diagram or a photograph or something to refer to, like we've just seen the graph in the previous question. It's important to spend a bit of time looking at, deciphering, getting familiar with the information before you even start answering the question. So spend 2 or 3 minutes looking at the resources and figuring out what it is and what's going on and looking at stuff so that you make sense of it before you start answering. If we have a look at question 4 here, this is exactly the scenario I'm just describing here. Again, we are given a figure. Study the figures below. This is a table of numbers, right, which shows the imports and the exports, and then answer the questions that follow. So in millions of rands per year, this is all the stuff we imported and how much of it we imported in a particular year, which is in this case 1995. On the other side of the table, this is how much money we spent on all the stuff we exported or sold in millions of rands in that one particular year, 1995. So have a look at some of this information. In 1995, we imported 5,102 million. Remember, you can add another 6 zeros onto that number because we're talking about rands in millions. 3,838 million of inedible raw materials, chemicals, textiles, metal and metal products, machinery, motor vehicles and other manufacturing goods, and then all the other stuff that they don't want to list they call unclassified. So we imported 9,785 million rands worth of unclassified goods, cell phones, whatever, right. Were there even cell phones in 1995? I can't remember. They're very recent. Exports. Food. We exported 7,505 million rands worth of food in that year. Metal ores, chemicals, diamonds, including industrial diamonds, metal and metal products, iron, steel, those sorts of things, machinery and transport equipment, and then, again, anything that we don't want to list or they don't want to put on this list, they call other. 28,097 million rands worth of other stuff was exported. Now, this is the key information here. Sorry, let's just fix that over there. Right. Can you see that in 1995, we imported more than what we exported? We imported 98,614 million rand worth of stuff, goods, things, etc., etc. And that same year, we only exported 81,219 million rands worth of all of those things that are listed over there. Just important here, clarification, gold export value that year was 20 of that, right? Gold contributed 20,178 million rands worth as well. Right, so we've looked at the information, we've deciphered some of the stats, and we've looked at what this table or this list of figures is all about. Let's start answering some of the questions. Question 4.1.1. What is meant by the term balance of trade? Remember, I hope you've studied your definitions or your terminology so that you can answer this question. So for 4 marks, we need to say it is the comparison, right, of the, oops, my handwriting has deteriorated, the comparison of the value of all imports to all exports in a particular year. Now, if you go back to the graph, remember we're talking about the year 1995, 1 year after our first democratic election. So those numbers there that I'm talking about here is what we're talking about as balance of trade. When you take the imports compared to the exports and you get a number, do we have a positive balance of trade or a negative balance of trade? All those sorts of things can be calculated or determined from that information. But balance of trade as a concept is when we compare the value of imports and exports in a particular year That's how we're going to get our 4 marks over there. We have to talk about the value of it and the comparison aspect, 2 marks. The imports and exports, or the variables or the things that are being compared, and it's done in a year time period or over a time space of a year, 12 months. That will get us our other 2 marks over there, so that gives us 4 marks. Question 4.1.2. With reference to the table above, critically discuss the importance of gold for the balance of trade. Now remember, what we've answered in question 4.1.1 and what we've deciphered in the graph or in the resource material, in this case it's a list of figures, a table of imports versus exports, is going to help us answer the remaining questions, or the questions that are following after one another as they go on. So here we have to say for 2 marks, why is gold so important in the balance of trade? Gold is very important because we base our economy's well-being on it. Right, so it is the basis of our economy. Oops, I'm thinking ahead of what I'm writing. It is the basis of our economy and how we measure economic growth and what we do economically speaking. It is an important export. So in other words, we make a lot of money from exporting gold to the rest of the world who wants it for valuing of their economies and to make things like jewelry and all sorts of other products from gold as well. And it helps to offset, right? Offset has got a double F, offset the costs of imports. So gold is used as a valuable sort of trading mechanism, as it were, and we get 2 marks there for talking about its importance, the fact that it is an important export product, and it helps us balance or to keep in check the costs of our imports and how much money we spend on imported materials as well. Here comes the big question now, right? 4.1.3, which is 6 marks. Discuss, talk about in detail, right? Go into quite a bit of detail. That's what discuss means. The importance of gold in the balance of trade by making use to the above figures. So now they want you to use the resource material above and some of these statistics there that you can see in your answer and in discussing this aspect of gold being so important as the balance of trade. Okay, first of all, we're going to say gold is the single most important export in South Africa. Gold is one of the most important things we export. And the value of gold obviously fluctuates on a daily basis. If you listen to the news, you hear how much the gold price is today, etc., etc. Okay, so first point, gold is the single most important aspect compared to the value of all exports, and it is a good measuring stick or a yardstick of how much we pay for stuff. Secondly, you can say that gold's contribution fluctuates. Remember, I spoke about that briefly. Gold's contribution fluctuates. What does the word fluctuates means? It means goes up or down. Fluctuates. I must also learn how to spell. There we go. Fluctuates on a daily basis. And this fluctuating of the gold price, which is dependent on the exchange rates, is how much stuff is worth and how much the value of something is. Right? Remember, we compare our rand to things like the dollar and the euro and other currencies like the pound and the yen, etc., etc. And then finally, gold prices determine values or the price of various goods. So gold is actually a very important commodity, and it determines how much something is valued or how important, and the price sort of ranges of what stuff is in our country. Okay, 6 marks there. You need 3 points, nicely outlined, explained, sufficiently discussed in a lot of detail, but they also want some figures here So we go back to the graph and we look there. In 1995, gold was 20,178. So we can talk about that here. For example, gold constituted or was 20, oopsie, I want to put an R there for rand, 20,000, what was the statistic up there? 178 million rands worth of value in 1995. So we can just put some statistics down there which basically supports our discussion or what we wrote there in the question. All right, question 4.2. Now remember, whatever you've answered in a particular question can influence or speak to or sort of get you thinking about other aspects or concepts related to that theme or that topic. So whatever you've answered beforehand can necessarily or should be important for what follows. So don't think that everything is done in isolation and you're just going to get certain questions and not others. Let's have a look at question 4, for example. The remainder of question 4, 4.2. South Africa hosted the 2010 FIFA World Cup. Remember, half the world was here. Well, not half the world, but many millions of people came to visit our country, and there were many ways in which South Africa benefited. Use what you have read and the knowledge obtained from the World Cup to answer the following questions. 4.2.1. Name the 2 services that benefited from hosting the World Cup. The fact that we were chosen to host the World Cup had many positive spin-offs and benefits for South Africa, right? What are 2 services or 2 parts of the economy you think are the most sort of beneficial from this whole process? Think of where did people stay and how did they get around, right? That is the most common or the most logical thing to think about. And for 4 marks here, we can talk about 4.2.1, saying the hotel industry or the accommodation. And remember, the hotel or accommodation industry is a tertiary sector of our economy because it provides a service. And secondly, also things like taxis and transport. People had to get around. They flew from city to city for various matches using our airports and our aircraft. So those sorts of things here. Anything that you speak about which is related to the services or the tertiary aspect of the economy is going to get you 4 marks for question 421. 4.2.2, unemployed people from the townships found jobs during this period of time. June, July 2010, lots of people found work. Suggest 3 occupations, right? Say which 3 types of jobs had to employ more people prior to the games being held here, and that is for 6 marks. So you can talk about security companies because obviously we wanted to keep all our tourists safe. Security guards, they got jobs. Secondly, construction industry employed thousands or hundreds of thousands of people because you wanted builders, right? People to build the stadium, the roads, the infrastructure, the Rea Vaya, all of those things we had to put in place to get people around. And then another industry or another aspect was the transportation. We employed hundreds or thousands of people to be bus drivers for the Rea Vaya, for example, the Gautrain. All of that came on board and people had to get around the city and around various places to see matches. So that created job creation as well. 6 marks for question 4.2.2. 4.2.3, suggest 3 positives. What were the good things for South Africa in the years that follow the World Cup? Now remember, in a question like this, 4.2.3, we are getting into an aspect of the paper where your opinion or your ideas are obviously flexible and allowed, but make sure that you explain yourself clearly and that you write sensibly so that they accept your viewpoint or your ideas in the answer to these questions. There's no necessarily right or wrong answer here, but make sure that you convince the marker by writing clearly and sensibly so that they give you the marks. So for 6 marks here, what are we going to say for 4.2.3? What 3 things were good for South Africa after the World Cup had finished and gone? First of all, we had all this beautifully upgraded infrastructure, right? How many different stadiums? I can't remember the number now. They were all rebuilt or revamped or upgraded. So we had infrastructure like stadia, roads. I mean, the Gautrain is a perfect example. If it wasn't for the World Cup, one has to wonder whether or not we would have had the Gautrain, but that's a whole debatable or cynical issue that I won't get you involved in. Gautrain, roads, building of stadia, upgrading of infrastructure, all those sorts of things, that is worth 2 marks, a discussion over there. Then another suggestion you could make here is that we had more foreign visitors than ever. And foreign visitors are good for South Africa because they spend their hard-earned dollars or pounds or yen or euros, which are worth more than the rand, okay, created more foreign revenue, and foreign revenue is worth more money than rands. So our tourist industry basically was very well off and contributed nicely to the economy. We had millions and millions of people visiting South Africa, which was great. And then foreign investment, when companies or people came here as tourists, they saw that they could do business with South Africa, they could bring their companies here, trade, and they could basically engage with us about buying and selling of material. So foreign investments grew, more companies were sufficiently happy about South Africa's progress. In the news, it was such a big thing about how successful the World Cup was, and everyone was surprised at how well we ran it. All of that created a positive vibe and a positive sort of atmosphere, and people wanted to come to South Africa, and they have been for the last 3 or 4 years since then. And obviously our tourism industry has skyrocketed and grown quite nicely as well. Question 4.2.4, the last one here, for 4 marks, and then this totals a section here for 30 marks as part of this human geography part of the paper. The World Cup was held in June, July 2010, remember? Why was this an even bigger bonus for South Africa? For 2 times 2, 4 marks. All right, first of all, that is winter time in South Africa, so now you have to bring a little bit of your climatology learning and apply it to your economic geography. Winter time in South Africa, 2 marks, and that means that hotels are less busy in our sort of off-peak season. Hotels less busy that time of the year because obviously people in South Africa don't go on holiday too much in winter. They don't stay in hotels necessarily because that's expensive. And so obviously there was more space or accommodation available for our visitors, our international visitors. And that availability obviously meant that more people could come and it was more viable as well. You could also speak here in question 4.2 about the fact that South Africa's winter climate is very moderate compared to places like England or America or Germany, all those other European nations of the world. So people came here because it wasn't that cold and they felt comfortable to be here because we've got a nice moderate winter climate. So obviously they enjoyed coming here and seeing South Africa. It's also quite a nice time of the year in many other respects as well. So you can speak about those aspects over there. All right, now we're going to look at some of the questions that you've got there as a homework assignment or part of your homework activities. And remember, we've given these to you here just to provide extra practice or extra sort of stimulus once you've studied these sections of your textbook or gone through your notes and the work that your teachers have done with you in this respect, so that you can practice some of these concepts even further. I'm afraid that's all we have time for now, but there is another question 3 that you can do in your homework exercise. Please study hard and all the best for your exams.